Episode 95, the Chief Executive Officer of UPS, Carol Tomé. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Carol Tomé. Carol is the Chief Executive Officer of UPS. Previously, she served as Chief Financial Officer for the Home Depot. Carol serves as board member for Verizon Communications, board of councilors for the Carter Center, a board trustee for Grady Memorial Hospital, and the Atlanta Botanical Garden. Carol has been named twice to the Forbes list of the world's 100 most powerful women and was listed second on the Wall Street Journal's list of best chief financial officers and among the top 50 most powerful women in business by Fortune magazine. Well, Carol, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Glenn.
It's great to have you. So, first off, any guess where my wife and I are going this summer?
I'm going to hope you're going to Jackson, Wyoming.
First time ever.
Really? You're going to have a blast.
First time, never been to that part of the world.
Really?
Yeah. I think it's changed a little bit since your day.
Well, when I was a little girl, it was 3,000 people. It's a little bit bigger now.
A little bit bigger. And I think a little bit more expensive.
It's the most expensive county in the United States of America these days.
We struggled to find some place to stay for less than like $500-600 a night.
Yeah, but it's worth it. It's so beautiful. And my grandmother's house was the first house to have running water in the town of Jackson. It's now was moved, and the fire station is now where I used to play as a little girl. But it's a special place, and the national park systems are gorgeous. So get into Grand Teton National Park in Yellowstone.
Yep, that's exactly what the trip is all about.
Good.
So I want to ask you about Jackson, because growing up, I've heard you talk about how you learned to fish and hunt and work off the land. And I also heard you say that you had this amazing childhood. It sort of sounds like a lot of work. So what am I missing here?
Well, it's just such a beautiful place to grow up. And my parents were amazing because they told me I could be anything and do anything I wanted. And I believed them, which was, instilled in me a great sense of self-confidence. It certainly has propelled me throughout the years. But just growing up, I just learned the basics of life. And that really, I think, is fundamentally important to all of us, to learn those basics of life. Because life is going to send you down twists and turns and curves. And if you know how to handle those because you got the basics nailed, it can really propel you for an amazing life.
Yeah, I never learned how to cook and hunt, so maybe that's why I'm not the chief executive officer of UPS. But it wasn't like you're responsible for putting food on the table, or were you?
So it's so interesting. So my dad was a community banker, but he was also a great hunter. And so we actually did live and eat off the land. So we would hunt elk and deer and antelope and duck and geese and catch trout and mackinaw. And that was the source of protein for our family. We also grew lambs and pigs and chickens and that sort of thing. So all the protein sources were we either hunted, fished, or grew as farming produce, if you will. And then vegetables and fruit. Growing up in Jackson in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was really hard to get fresh fruit in the wintertime, believe it or not. And even today, I still have family there. Today, because of the snowfall, they're having trouble getting produce into the town because the passes that go into the town of Jackson are closed. So we ate a lot of canned stuff as a kid, but it taught me a lot about the basics.
And you were also, it seems like, pretty competitive. You were a competitive skier. What were some of the areas that you were focused on?
So my dad put me on skis when I started to walk. And so I've skied my entire life. And the winters in Jackson are pretty tough. So I was a competitive racer from all of my youth through college, and I was a downhill racer. Mm-hmm. And that taught me a lot as well about the need to prep before you compete. And then when you compete hard, and not to be afraid of going as fast as you can. Yeah,
no, as fast as you can. Downhill racing, 60, 70, 80 miles per hour?
Exactly.
Okay, so I would be scared out of my mind to go 60 miles per hour down. Even if I were semi-athletically gifted. Were you naturally fearless, or Like, did you have to learn to get over your fears?
Well, I think because I started skiing when I was so close to the ground, I was never afraid of falling. And you do it enough. I was skiing every day of my life. You do it enough, well, every day in the winter anytime anyway. You do it enough, you're not afraid.
Yeah. But you were, when I say competitive, I mean all the way through college.
Yeah.
You were competing.
Yeah.
So if you take a step back and think about what were some things that you sort of carried with you throughout life from that? It sounds like prep, you're saying, was what do you think?
Prep for sure, because I was not only a downhill racer, but I did slalom and giant slalom. And the way you prep for those races is that you step up the mountain. And I don't know if you ski at all, but you sidestep up the mountain to understand the placement of the gates, and you imagine the way you're going to run that race. There's a lot of prep that goes into. So when you are in the starting gate, when the buzzer is called, you can immediately go down that course because you already have it in your head. You've got it memorized in your head where you're going to turn, how fast you'll take a turn, so on and so forth. And that has stayed with me on everything I do. I'm really prepared. When I go into a meeting, I'm really prepared. If I'm making a presentation, I'm really prepared. I've always prepared in advance, and it's done well for me.
And do you, on that note, because I interview a lot of athletes and others were, cave divers, we'll talk about this visualization exercise going into it. And you sort of reference that with skiing. Same thing when you're going into a big meeting, a big negotiation, maybe a shareholder meeting. Do you go through some kind of visualization exercise like that?
It's not just visualization. I actualize it. So I talk to myself in front of a mirror, and I'll do counterpoint all the time, point counterpoint all the time, because I want to really think through the types of questions that might be asked and how I'm going to answer them. And if I don't like the way I answer it the first time, I'll go through it again and again and again until I get it where I want it to be.
So you're excelling on the ski slopes, and this is going back to college. Maybe not so much in your studies at the time, and the grades were falling.
Yeah.
And then you tell a story about a professor that one day sort of called you out in the middle of class and said something to the effect of, Carol, I know you can show us more than what you're showing us. And it sort of snapped you into high gear. Can you share that story?
Yeah, so I excelled in high school, and then when I went to college, I just didn't really care, and so I wasn't excelling. And in fact, silly things like in one class, the grade was based on attendance, and I skied instead of attended the class. So I actually got a D in that class. Can you imagine? I got a D in that class.
No.
And it was Wyoming history, so that was really embarrassing. But I didn't really, at this point, I still didn't really care. But luckily, every day I thank God for this. I had a professor who called me out and said, "You are better than this." I'm like, "Oh, you're right, I am." So I turned that around pretty quickly.
I mean, your parents had believed in you
Totally.
from a young age, but somehow you needed someone else to just, hey, Carol, you're better than this, essentially.
I did, and maybe it was because I was a student in college in the 70s. There was a lot of apathy going on. I'm not entirely sure why, but I certainly wasn't me during that time frame. But he kicked it back up for me.
I'll be sure not to ask you too many questions on Wyoming history, given...
That would be good. That would be really good.
So you go into business school, and coming out of business school, the plan originally was to follow in your father's footsteps, become a community banker. You'd worked for him over the summers and sort of took a liking to it, probably admired your father as well,
Yeah.
I would assume. And then out of left field, he decided to sell the business. And as if that wasn't enough, he then shared with you that he and your mother were getting divorced after a number of years, after a number of decades.
Yes.
So, I mean, granted, you're already out of the house at the time. You're not being raised anymore, but that must have been somewhat trying time for you, no?
Well, it wasn't in a number of different ways because we were a close-knit family, and anytime families are taken apart by divorce, it's a tough time. But candidly, at the time, it was more about me because I'm like, what am I going to do? I thought I was going to work for you and take over the bank, much like you had taken over the bank from your father. What am I going to do? So I decided that I would be a banker. And I took one interview in school, which is not good advice for anyone, but I took one interview with the largest bank in Colorado and was fortunate enough to be hired into a training program. which was great, and that started the beginning of my career now over 40 years ago. The other thing I learned through this lesson is just how remarkable my mother truly was. She's no longer here, but what a remarkable woman she was. And she was so committed to the family business that as part of the divorce, she received some proceeds from the sale of the bank. She turned around and invested those proceeds back into the new owner of the bank, so back into the new bank, if you will, which that bank prospered and grew. And shortly before the financial crisis, so mid-2000s, that bank was sold to Wells Fargo. And my mother, who at the time of divorce had never even owned a checkbook, didn't know how to write a check, made a 900% return on her money and left an estate worth millions of dollars for her children and grandchildren. So I learned so much about just if you stick to what you believe in and really invest in what you believe in, really good things can happen.
It's interesting. I want to come back to this because later on, when you went out into the world and became a banker, coincidentally, one of the deals you're working on, I think, was the disposition of that very bank that your father had sold. So I want to come back to that because there's a story I want to share about what you learned about that bank and a little bit about your father under that. But just to sort of fast forward the story, you went into banking. You were a big deal queen, if you will.
Yeah.
And you, I think, went on to restructure a small business. You got to take a company public.
Yes.
A lot of exposure at a very, very young age. And then you were asked to join the Home Depot. You had come to Atlanta by this time. You knew about the business. You loved shopping in it. And they asked you to join. You were the first female officer at the company. I think you joined as treasurer. Was that right?
I joined as treasurer.
The first female officer and the first officer from the outside period. Was that intimidating, sort of walking into an all-boys club like that?
Well, I love the company, and I love home improvement. So that part wasn't intimidating. Mm-hmm. What was intimidating is I was hired for a particular reason, I believed, and they weren't quite ready for that reason. And so every time I would open my mouth to talk about return on invested capital or economic value added or something like that from a financial perspective, they're like, you're not speaking my language, you're not from here. And I'm like, wow, this isn't going very well.
It was falling in deaf ears.
Yeah, they weren't ready for it. And I didn't have enough sensitivity to understand that. So I'm like, this isn't going very well. And if I don't take control of the situation, it's not going to go well at all. So I ended up speaking the language of retail and the language of home improvement retailing by working in the stores. And I worked in the stores a lot. And that changed my effectiveness and my ability to make an impact, I believe.
Literally worked in the retail environment, not in the back room, but you were welcome to Home Depot. How can I help you?
Yeah, no, I was schlepping carts. I did everything.
Did someone give you that advice, or did you just realize that if you don't get in there and learn this trade, and because it's not just learning the trade, it's being able to, I assume a fair amount of maybe humility that's needed here. I mean, you're coming in with a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience. The company wasn't quite ready for it. So this might have been the first career setback, if that's the right word, that you've had along the way.
Well, it was just a big learning for me about what matters. And, at Home Depot, customers matter. And so for me, it was about, okay, how do I serve the customer? And I can serve. I know how to serve. So I'm like, how do I serve the customers, and how do I learn the business to better serve the customers? So it was actually a lot of fun. I enjoyed every moment I spent in the store. Every moment. It was a lot of fun. A lot of hard work, but a lot of fun.
Yeah. When you talk about serving the customers, just on that note, because I know this notion of an inverted pyramid is something that you've sort of imported here at UPS, but you learned that from Home Depot. What does that mean? How does that work?
Yeah, Bernie Marcus and Arthur Blank, who were the founders of that great company, had this, I think, a unique management construct where the leaders of the company are at the bottom of the pyramid. If you think about a management construct as a pyramid, they flipped it around so they're at the bottom of the pyramid. And they're at the bottom of the pyramid because they bore the weight for the decisions that they made and the actions that they took. They for that weight so that he could free up the associates to take care of their customers. And I think that's absolutely the right way to think about. As a leader, your responsibility is to bear that weight, to actually understand you're there for the people, not for you. The management constructs where the leaders are at the top and the people are at the bottom, guess what happens when things go sideways? The people bear the weight for all those decisions. It should be the leader who's bearing that weight. So it was a really great learning.
You were known as having this tireless work ethic.
Yeah.
I think not that others weren't working hard, but you really took it to another level. And I don't know at what time this happened over the course of the career at Home Depot, but it seems like you almost had an epiphany, if you will, in terms of what's it all about and what's my purpose.
So I've had a few moments of purpose, if you will. And the first moment was early in my Home Depot days. I was working a lot of hours every single day, actually, Monday through Sunday. And I woke up one day and I looked at myself in the mirror and I asked myself a question. Like, Carol, what is your tombstone going to read? And that's an interesting question because I plan to be cremated, but you get the question.
Yes.
And so I thought about it and I'm like, well, it's going to read, she worked hard. And when I realized that's what it would read, I was horrified. I'm like, that is not why I'm here. I know God has a purpose for me. I know I'm here for a reason, and that's not it. So I asked myself another question, and that time it was, what do you want it to read? And I thought, well, what I want it to read is she made a difference. And it really was very a transformative moment for me because it changed how I interacted with people because I'm like, I really am here to make a difference. And so it changed how I interact with my peers, with my family, with my husband, with God. It just changed me. And it was really, really pretty an important, pivotal time for me. And maybe even want to work harder, if you will, because I knew what I had a purpose. Now, fast forward, and you may want to talk about this now or later, but I'm going to talk about it now. When I got to UPS 3 years ago now, I asked our company, what's our purpose? We knew what we did. We were moving 2% of the world's GDP every day, 6% of the U.S. GDP. We knew what we did, but we hadn't declared our purpose. So we put together a cross-functional team, and they did an awesome job of interviewing existing UPSers, retirees, customers, communities, and iterated and landed on our company purpose, which is moving our world forward by delivering what matters. And I love that purpose because you can unpack it in so many different ways. It's not just about moving goods, it's about doing good too. But that made me think about my purpose.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, your purpose is not really capturing. It's not really capturing you, Carol. And it's also not really capturing why you're here. Because, I retired for a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, I gotta think about this more. So I really thought about it. Spent some real time thinking about, okay, why am I here? And so I've landed on a new purpose for me, which really I think better describes why I'm here. And that is lead to inspire, serve to create, give to remain. And every day I get up and I'm like, yeah, that's why I'm here. That's what I'm living. Purpose is really powerful.
Yeah. I sense that purpose is really important. People are really important to you.
Yep.
And I skipped over something because there was another moment, I think back when you were a banker and you were doing deals all over the world and you were, again, quite good at it. And there was a moment when you had to do a performance review for someone that worked for you. You couldn't do it in person. We were stuck in a deal. It didn't go over so well.
Yeah, well, that was my big aha moment, what leadership should be like, because I was not leading the way you should. It was time to give a performance review to a woman on my staff who needed some coaching and feedback. She wasn't knocking it out of the park, really wasn't meeting all of the expectations. But rather than coaching her and giving her feedback, I just didn't want to deal with it. But it was performance review time, so I had to give her a performance review. I'm like, I've got to do this. So I was in New York, she was in Colorado. I'm like, okay, I'm going to give her this feedback, this performance review over the phone. And the next thing I knew, she quit. And I'm like, oh, she didn't quit the company, she quit me. I'm a bad boss. That is not the way to give feedback. That's not the way to give a performance review. In fact, I should be investing in people and helping them reach their highest potential, whatever it may be. So I'm like, all right, Carol, I pledge to myself that from now on, no one's ever going to quit me. If they leave me, they're going to leave because they're getting promoted to a great opportunity. They're leaving me because they're retiring, or they're leaving me because it's time for them to leave. But no one's going to quit me. And since then, I'm really happy to say nobody's ever quit me.
I mean, you really took it personally, huh?
Personally. I think this is why we have leader jobs. And if we don't want to do this, if we don't want to take it personally, then we shouldn't take the leader jobs.
During the time you were at Home Depot, I think the company grew from, roughly speaking, 400 stores or so, maybe $14 billion in revenue, to 2,000 plus stores, over $100 billion in revenue. And what's amazing to me, just as a leadership advisor, is the fact that you're able to scale yourself as the company was scaling. That's pretty rare. More often than not.
Is it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Usually it's like, thank you very much. You're now in over your head. People tend to have tight ranges in terms of how they perform. By the way, not to mention that before Home Depot, that manufacturing business was way, right, orders of magnitude smaller than Home Depot.
Orders of magnitude.
So it seems like there must have been some kind of reinvention that you would have had to have gone through as the company is scaling, and the need for you as a leader is evolving, no?
Well, of course. One thing I learned is the power of surrounding yourself with people who are smarter than you, faster than you, better than you. They lift you up and give you wings so you can scale. Because if you're not doing that, you end up punching down 2 or 3 levels below your weight because you don't have the right team supporting you. So I've worked really hard on creating, outstanding teams of really talented people, and I'm super proud of that. The landscape is littered with CFOs of publicly traded companies who worked for me. There are CEOs of publicly traded companies who work for me, including Ted Decker, who's the current CEO of Home Depot. I hired him over 20 years ago. Most of his Home Depot career he spent with me. Hal Lawton, who's the CEO of Tractor Supply, who was on my finance team, and then I put him on Project Leopard, which was a big e-commerce initiative, which sent him off on an amazing journey. And I could keep going on this. I'm just so proud of that because I understand just what it's done for me. Because each time I have these brilliant people working for me, it's helping me scale up.
And you've had, I think, like 10 or 12 former direct reports and now CFOs of public companies. So how much of that, is you're just being a talent magnet and having a really good eye for who's exceptional versus bringing people in who are really good and taking them from good to great?
I think it's both. I think I'm a really good teacher. I think I groom people really well, but I also can pick talent. I can pick talent. Maybe that's part of my superpowers. And that's one reason I'm here. One reason I came out of retirement into UPS is I love to develop people. And I'm like, we got lots of folks, over 500,000 people here. So I'm like, this is such a great opportunity for me. And also, I'm the first outside CEO at this company, which is 116 years old. And I saw what the board went through to go to the outside to bring in a CEO. It's not easy. That's not easy. And you can make mistakes. We see that happen from time to time. So I'm like, I really want to focus on internal development. I really think my success here, in many ways, is my succession.
Yeah, you were the first outsider at Home Depot at that level, and then the first outsider here. You definitely know how to break some glass, that's for sure. Before we jump on to UPS, you were flying high at Home Depot, right? You're one of the key executive officers. I think it was 2014 when there was a CEO succession.
Yes.
And you were on the short list. It didn't work out for you. They went with someone else. I imagine must have been a pretty big setback, a pretty big disappointment for you.
Yeah, just to be perfectly candid, my heart was broken. If the board had asked me to take that job, I would have said, of course, yes.
Yeah.
I love Home Depot. But the board picked another person, and he was awesome. He did a fantastic job, Craig Menier, an awesome CEO. But I had decisions to make. There were 3 of us that were being considered, and the other person who didn't get the role left immediately. And my friends were all like, you should leave. You didn't get the job, you should leave. And that happens oftentimes in CEO successions, the people who don't get the
I'm sure your phone was ringing off the hook for sure, right?
And I listen a lot, Glenn. I listen, I seek advice and I listen. And Frank Blake, who was retiring, said to me, Carol, I'd like you could be a CEO someplace else, but I'd like you to think about it through the lens of impact. Where would you have the biggest impact? And I'm like, Craig is great. He was my peer. I greatly admire him, respect him. He hadn't had a lot of corporate experience, like board experience. And I've been in the boardroom for my entire career. And I'm like, I think maybe I could have bigger impact here if I stayed and worked with him and the rest of the leadership team. And I'm so glad I did. It was the absolute right decision for me.
Kudos to you for, I think a lot of people would have just gone away, whether it's the right move or not, just out of, resentment or frustration. But the fact that you stuck around, supported Craig for a number of years, I mean, that speaks volumes to you, who you are as a person and a leader. Yeah,
I think this wasn't about me. I really loved Home Depot, and you don't love a company, you love the people of the company. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I love y'all, and I'm here for you. Mm-hmm. So you can check your ego at the door, and I was hurt. My heart was broken. It wasn't that they didn't pick the right person. Craig was great. I wanted it, but they picked Craig. Okay, all right. My heart was broken, but I love the company, so I'm glad I stayed.
And then once you finally stepped down, which was 2019, I'm guessing you must have gotten involved in charity, boards, right? Gardening. I don't know what, but I assume you're like, this is my new life, and you're probably adjusting to it. And all of a sudden, the phone rings, and hey, it's UPS call. I know you were on the board at UPS for a number of years, but I imagine this wasn't something you had anticipated.
Oh, gosh, no. It's so interesting to think about retirement because I talked to Craig. I'm like, okay, you and I are the same age. We can't both retire at the same time. So one of us needs to go first. And so I said, what is your plan? And when he told me his plan, I'm like, oh, wow. That means I'd have to stay with him and then stay longer, a couple of years after him, forever, who new CEO is going to be. And I'm like, I'm not going to do that. So I'm like, I've got a CFO ready candidate. This is awesome. I can get out of his way. He can take the job. I can go retire. So to your point, I put together a plan. I'm very planful. So I put together this plan. I'm like, all right, I'm going to do so many corporate boards. I was on the UPS board, the Verizon board, the Cisco board. So I'm going to do my corporate boards. I'm going to do my community boards. So I'm on Grady Hospital here in Atlanta, the Atlanta Botanical Garden here in Atlanta. So I'm going to do my community boards. And then I have my foundation. So Ramona, my husband, and I set up the Tomé Foundation. So we have a beautiful foundation office. Yeah. And then I have my farm in the northwest corner of Georgia. So I had it all laid out.
I didn't know you had a farm.
Oh, I have a 650-acre farm.
You're going back to your roots.
Totally.
You're back in Jackson,
totally.
Here in Georgia. That's great.
Totally. So I left and started this new life, which, oh, by the way, was extraordinarily hard for me because I was bored out of my mind.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, Carol, this is just going to take a while. This is going to take a while. You've got everything laid out. Just kind of get into the rhythm. Mm-hmm. I'd get up every single morning. I'd put on my work clothes. I'd go to the foundation office. I'm like I'm supposed to be retired, like thinking about a different life. So anyway, I'm trying to figure this out. At the same time, UPS is going through succession planning for David Abney, who was the CEO at the time. And what UPS did is they hired a third party to help create a persona of the skills and attributes that the next CEO should possess. Mm-hmm. And they matched that persona up against the existing leadership team here, and it's a terrific leadership team. But no one matched yet. It just didn't match. So the folks on the board, and I was not part of that group, who were thinking about CEO succession, decided to go to the outside. Mm-hmm. When they put together that search committee and decided to go to the outside, they took that persona and they looked at me and said, you fit. We'd like you to be considered. And I'm like, me? I'm 62 at the time. I'm 62 years old. Are you really? You don't think I'm too old? They're like, no, we don't think you're too old. In fact, our retirement age is in the mid-70s. No, we don't. And I'm like, wow. It was just not on my on my radar screen at all.
What do you think that this is interesting, because they've never gone to the outside. It's a culture known for promoting from within. And I'm guessing the persona was not a former chief financial officer.
No.
They could have had their pick of any been there, done that CEO. So why do you think they went with you? What was it beyond just the technical skills and the financial background that attracted them?
I think there were a couple of things. One, value creation. So it wasn't just the technical skills, but the stock had been flat here for a long time. And they were looking for someone who could, not through the finance lens, but through the strategic lens, work on value creation. And I ran strategy at Depot for, I think, since 2007. So over 12 years I ran strategy. So that was sort of in my wheelhouse. Strategy is definitely in my wheelhouse. Then I know how to make a buck. So you had that. The other thing, though, I really think is a tipping point, because there are a lot of talented people out there, tons. The tipping point is my respect for culture. UPS has a very unique culture. It's a fantastic culture, and I respect culture. And they knew whomever came into the company would have to get the culture, or else the body was going to reject the transplant. And I had a great respect for that, understanding that there were some things we needed to change, but I had a great respect for the culture, and I think that was the tipping point.
Mm-hmm. When did your mom pass away?
She passed away in 20.
Did she get a chance to see her baby daughter become chief executive for UPS?
Yeah, so she did. She was in a stage of dementia, so never quite understood what I was doing, but always was 100% supportive, which was fantastic.
Yeah. I want to talk about this idea of culture and organ rejection, because there's an interesting parallel that you went through, where you were a part of it at Home Depot when they went through a CEO change, a different one than when we were talking about.
Yeah.
And this is, some people will remember this, but GE went through their own succession when Jack was looking to step down. And there were 3 people that were essentially competing for his spot. And these were, GE back in the day was...
Unbelievable talent.
Yes, their leadership was unparalleled. So any of these people that didn't get the spot, and of course Jeff Immelt got it, so the other 2 were on the market. One of them, Bob Nardelli, came over to Home Depot. And this isn't about my throwing Bob under the rug. He's a phenomenal leader, but just to maybe oversimplify, he's probably trying to bring a lot of best practices, a lot of playbook that he knew and executed from an exceptional organization into another exceptional organization, but that didn't work the same way, different culture. And after 2-3 years, he was essentially rejected. So you witness all that, and here you are coming into UPS, a lot of amazing lessons learned from Home Depot. I'm sure a lot of things you'd like to import, but also wanting, like you said, to respect the culture of this organization. It's been around for, 100 years or so?
This is our 116th year.
116th year. So how has that been a tough sort of wire to balance on, in terms of both wanting to maybe bend culture a little, but not break it? You want to be accepted and embraced, but you want to be able to drive some change while you're here.
Really important to understand the cornerstone of the culture. And at Home Depot, it was the inverted pyramid management construct. I'm just finishing Power Failure, which is the new book on GE. Highly recommend it. Okay. It's the story of GE from the beginning to now. And you can understand that GE never had an inverted pyramid management construct. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying their construct is wrong. It wasn't Depot.
Yeah, it worked for GE at that time.
That time. It was not Depot, and it was a culture clash. Here, our culture is founded really in the words and the learnings that come from Jim Casey, who created this company 116 years ago as a teenager with a buddy and a $100 loan. This entrepreneurial, values-based, can-do culture, and it's so honoring that. So now I'll make that real for you. I meet with my leadership team once a week, and then every month we have a full-day executive council meeting. We start that executive council meeting with a reading from Jim Casey. And then we talk about what the words mean today, because you can appreciate that the words of 1907 or 1927 or 37 maybe are not the words we might use today. A bit archaic, certainly singular gender focused, so on and so forth. But we kind of contemporize those, but we actually spend time talking about that because it's who we are, who we are. And so I appreciate that. And if I had come in and said, we're not going to do that, we're not going to talk about Jim Casey, or we're not going to talk about the former leaders, I think culturally that would have been a serious, big problem here.
Now, that said, it seems like, and you can correct me here, but there have been some areas where you have pushed back a little, maybe challenging some cultural norms. So, for example, this used to be a company which thrived on seniority.
Yep.
And you wanted to create more of a merit-based system. And there's another one, which I thought was interesting, which is around dress code.
Yep.
There's been this historically very strict dress code. I don't just mean the uniforms, which I think are still pretty cool, but facial hair and your actual hairstyle, it was essentially restricting people's ability to express themselves, and in some cases was even more disproportionately affecting people, of certain maybe races and ethnicities and this sort of thing. And you sort of came in and said, no, we're doing away with all this, which, by the way, kudos to you, the right thing to do. But I'm guessing that wasn't necessarily universally embraced by a company that goes back 116 years, and a lot of people who don't like change and like living on how things have been done in the past.
I think Jim always intended that we bring our real, genuine, authentic self to work. I think we lost sense of what that really meant. He said, when you build up others, you build up yourself. Well, one way you build up others is you let them bring their real, genuine, authentic self to work. We just lost sight of what that meant. And our policies were so restrictive. If you were African American, you couldn't have natural hair, so you couldn't have a fro or braid or twist. If you were male and wanted to have facial hair, we were prohibited from that. And our tattoo policy was more restrictive than the U.S. Army. So we're like, I think we can let go of the edge of the pool here and relax those standards. Our customers will be fine because, oh, by the way, they look like us now that we've relaxed our standards. Our customers will be fine, and it gives you a sense of more authenticity. And we're building you up because we're respecting you as a person and who you are authentically. So actually, the organization, for the most part, celebrated the changes. I would say some of our retirees, not so much. And the customers were like, we're good, we're fine. As long as you deliver my package on time, I'm good. So that's all they really care about.
I mean, I'm guessing it probably didn't hurt that you're coming from the outside. Again, you've been part of it at a board level, but it might be really hard for someone who grew up in this organization to then go and challenge a lot of these norms that, have become accepted and where people become complacent. So probably help you coming in with an outsider's perspective, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm sure that was helpful. I think people too were wanting empowerment and the ability to actually change, but hadn't been granted permission. And I'm really all about granting permission. You run as hard and fast as you can until you hit that invisible fence and get zizzed, and then you know you've gone too far.
You've hired a chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. I think that reports directly to you.
Yes.
You further diversified the board, I believe, 3 women, 2 people of color. Not a question in this one, other than just admiration, for what you've done here.
Oh, well, thank you.
You're welcome. So I want to come back to what I alluded to earlier, which is this story of when you were a banker doing deals. And then, did I get this right, that one of the deals you were working on was the acquisition of your father's bank? And you obviously had to dig deep into the numbers, and you discovered that I guess there were probably a fair number of poorly underwritten loans. It wasn't maybe the cleanest, the healthiest balance sheet you had ever seen. And, through that lens, you got to understand that it's because your father really cared. He cared about the people he was serving in his community, cared probably more about the people than the integrity of the balance sheet, if you will, than the quality of the loans. And I take it you probably would have been or probably were a much better banker, let's say, than your father.
No, it's absolutely true. And it was so interesting at my father's eulogy when he passed away 9 years ago, the number of people who stood in line at the service to give testimony about how he saved them through the loans that he granted. They weren't very good loans, but he saved them.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
So it just got me to thinking about, to be a really good banker, and I hope this comes out the right way, you can't care too much. Because if you care too much, then you're going to be doing things that the bank shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
Right? As a fiduciary, you shouldn't be doing certain kinds of loans, even if people need access.
Yeah.
And one of the things you've done here at UPS is look across the entire portfolio of service offerings and say, we've got a lot of longstanding customers that go back years and years and years, but we have to make money. As a chief executive officer, we have to make money. We have an obligation to our shareholders. And so you've had to make some tough calls, as I understand, to part ways with some customers, I'm assuming longstanding customers, that weren't willing to pay what was needed to make it work for UPS. So I was just thinking about those two, that you have to be able to make tough decisions and almost be okay not being liked because you know what's best for the company, and you can't always do what's best and be well liked. You have to be willing sometimes to live with those trade-offs.
Well, I think they're trade-offs that we make every day. Mm-hmm. Strategically, I would frame what we're doing a bit differently than you. I would say that we are leaning towards the segment of the market that values our end-to-end network and leaning away from those that don't. And there are parts of the opportunity like healthcare and SMB where our end-to-end network really matters to them. So we're going to lean into those and lean away from others. I love all customers, but just I really want to lean into those that really value the network because we've made a huge investment in this network. It is the best network, so I want to serve them and serve them really well. But to your bigger question about being liked, if you have a need for high affinity, this is not a job for you. It's not. You want to be respected, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with you. And you have to make hard decisions that not everybody's going to like. And sometimes recommendations and proposals that people work on that are really thoughtful and really creative just don't fit strategically, and you have to say no. And that's disappointing to others, of course, when they hear that no, but that's the role that you have.
Have you always been comfortable saying no? Or was there some sort of crucible moment over the course early in your career where you learned to be okay with, like you said, being respected, but that doesn't always mean being liked?
So when I became the CFO at Home Depot, Bernie Marcus, who was the chair of the board at the time and a founder of the company, called me into his office. I had never been called into his office, and I was just so excited. So I went to his office, sat down on his couch. He said, "Carol, I have 2 pieces of wisdom for you or advice for you." I'm like, "Well, great. Great. What are they?" He said, "The first is I think you're very charming, and you should use your charm on Wall Street." And I'm like, "Oh, charming, I can do that." And then he said, "I won't know that you're doing your job until somebody calls you a bitch."
He said that.
He said that. And I'm like, "Oh, I can do that too." So I was kind of a hard ass, actually, that first year as CFO. And the way I said no, because I'm like, he wants me to be called something, so I can do that. That was not effective. I got my 360, which is, you're reviewed from your peers and your subordinates and your bosses after my first year, and I'm like, it wasn't very good. I'm like, I think I took his advice too literally. I need to think about how I go about this differently. So it changed the way I operated, and I worked more on building up deposits with people, helping them reach their goals, their aspirations, their business plans, so that if I had to take a withdrawal, I had built up enough in deposit that people were okay with the withdrawal. So I just changed the way I operated.
Well, again, you've broken a lot of glass over the years, and I mean that in the hugest compliment. You're a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. We're going back years and years and years when you first broke some of that glass at Home Depot. You're obviously smart. You're very driven. You've gone 60, 70 miles per hour down the slope and sort of through your life. But beyond that, if you sort of look back in the rearview mirror and say, here are maybe 2 or 3 of the ways that I've been able to navigate and be so successful. And I know it's asking you to sort of, toot your horn, but I'm asking. And so I imagine there are a lot of Carols out there that are, work really hard, care about people, care about purpose, all of these things, are doing the right things. And they're doing well, but they're not Carol Tomé. And I know there's bits of serendipity in all of our lives.
For
but,
sure.
But if we just sort of throw everything at serendipity, then we don't learn from what we can control. So what would you attribute it to?
Well, maybe a few things. I'm extraordinarily networked. I have worked my entire life, starting as a kid, in building a big Rolodex. I think it's an old-fashioned term.
Yeah.
But I'm networked. And my network has given me opportunities to do things that I never thought were possible. The way I got to the UPS board in 2003 is Sarbanes-Oxley happened. UPS hadn't been public for very long. They went public in the late 90s. They needed a financial expert. Mike Eskew, who was the CEO at the time, called up Bob Nardelli, who was the CEO, my boss at Home Depot, and said, I need a finance expert. It's like, Bob said, I got one. So I met with Mike, boom, I'm on the board. Just network, right? Then, Scott Davis, who was the CFO of UPS at the time, went on the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank board. They're like, we need another person to come on the board. He's like, well, here's Carol. She's great. So I meet the bank executives. I go on the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank board, chaired that bank board for most of my 6-year tenure there during the financial crisis with Ben Bernanke, with Tim Geithner, with Janet Yellen. I mean, the network just kept going and going and going. Every board opportunity, every opportunity that's come my way, it's because of my network. So I really encourage people to build that strong network and use it. Build your deposits. If somebody needs something, they need help with a fundraiser, they need help with something, I'm there. I'll say yes. They need me to speak at something, I say yes. So that if I have to take a withdrawal, I can take a withdrawal. So the network has been critically important. The other thing I believe, and that's not serendipity, that's work. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's a really good use of your time. The other thing, I do believe in my heart that the most important decision you'll make in your life is with whom you'll spend your life. And that might be a spouse or a partner or a friend or a pet. But that decision is the most important decision that you can make. Because I am incredibly blessed with my husband, Ramon. We've been married for nearly 40 years, together for almost 45. He is my biggest champion, supporter, and I don't know where I would be without him. That is, you have to have a support network of some sort, and really being intentional about that is really important. It's harder when you're young, but it's really, really important. Don't just fall in love, right? Really think about who you want to spend your life with. Are your values aligned, so on and so forth. And then lastly, if you think about Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, I'm a big believer if you're leaning in, you got to your career, you've got to lean in. But if you're leaning in, you're leaning away from something. It's just gravity. You're leaning away from something, and you have to be really clear with yourself about what you're leaning away from. And you need to be really comfortable with that, because you are going to make choices if you're really going to lean in. And you have to decide what those are, what you're leaning away from, and be good with that. For me, one thing that I've leaned away from all my life are vacations. I don't take them. Now, that may not work for some people. Some people love to go to exotic places around the world, love to time with friends and family. I hate it. I'm like, there'll be a time for that. There'll be time for that. So I don't take them. Which, just imagine how much time I get back by not doing that. A lot.
Any other sacrifices that you've had to make over the years?
I wouldn't say it was a sacrifice. It just didn't happen for us. We don't have any kids. It just didn't happen. But we've been able to live through our nieces and nephews. So we have 12, which is great. So we've been able to invest in them as they've grown, which is really rewarding.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering about that because you seem very family oriented.
Yeah, very
I think there was something I saw on some pictures someone dug up of you as a baby. And I think 4 generations or something like this in the picture.
With my great-grandmother, who was a homesteader.
It sort of, it choked you up a little bit. How will you know, looking ahead, assuming the board loves you, all the employees love you, everyone loves you, so no one's asking you to step down. And by the way, I can tell the energy you have is, I don't think you've lost anything from the days back when you were in your 20s, banking all over the world. Is there a point in time ahead where you feel like there are certain things I want to get done if I'm able to, and then I'll know it's time to step down? Or is it just like, one day at a time and I'll just keep going till I feel like I don't have the passion anymore? How do you think about it?
Well, I think I have an obligation to build an internal successor slate. And then once that slate is built and we're all good about it, then it's my obligation to step out of the way. But there are things I want to get done. There are a whole bunch of things I want to get done. So we'll be building that internal succession slate while working on the things that I want to get done. Some of those, candidly, are rails that we're laying now that I won't get done. For example, we've declared that we will be carbon neutral by 2050. I would be in my 90s in 2050, so I'm not going to be here then. But I'm going to lay the rails. I'm absolutely laying the rails right now. Here's the path. These are the rails that we can travel down to reach that goal. And there are a number of rails that we're laying down. I'm like, yep, we're going to lay these down, get the cars going down the rails, and then when it's time for me to go, I'll go.
When your parents told you you could do anything you wanted, I guess you really took that to heart. they weren't far off the mark. Do you think if you were to look back, at that 18-year-old flying down the mountain, and if she could look at Carol Tomé as chief executive of UPS, do you think she'd say, yeah, like that makes sense. I expect big things in my life? Or do you think she'd be like, oh my gosh, who the heck is that person doing that? Do you think you would have surprised your former self?
I really thought that I'd make a difference. I did think that. I didn't think I'd be doing this.
The name of this podcast is The Art of Excellence. And I chose the word because I feel like the word success is very defining in our heads, and excellence is more subject to interpretation. So I was curious, when you think of the word, what comes to mind?
There's so many ways to define excellence. But I will tell you, one of my pet peeves is rework. I hate it when you're trying to solve a problem when you don't think all the way around the problem. So maybe you only think 90 degrees or 180 degrees. You don't think 360, and then you end up having to do rework. I think that slows you down. So what I normally tell people is go slow to go fast. Or in terms of excellence, and I'll go back to my home improvement days, measure twice, cut once.
Measure twice, cut once. I like it. That's the most unique answer I've gotten on this one. This organization is lucky to have you. I know you're lucky to have them. It seems like,
For sure.
it's
such
an incredible
an
partnership.
awesome
And I know
company.
I could spend an hour talking about all the things you've done in just the brief 2 years that you've been here. By the way, most of it during a pandemic too, which we didn't even talk about.
Oh, a pandemic, a war, social unrest, political unrest, high inflation. Shall we go on?
But I imagine the more crazy it is, the more exciting it is for you.
It's never dull, that's for sure. And it's an amazing team. UPSers, their say-do ratio is high, which is really energizing to be around.
I cannot thank you enough, Carol. Honestly, what a pleasure to sit down with you for an hour and hear your story. And I know we barely scraped the surface, but learned so much. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, it's my pleasure, and really enjoyed chatting with you.
Hey everyone. Okay, please don't go away just yet. A couple favors to ask. Favor number one, and I know I've asked before, but if you haven't had a chance to leave a review and you enjoy the show, it would honestly mean a lot if you could go to iTunes and write a review. That goes a long way, so thank you for that. Also, had a chance to deliver a keynote based on a lot of the learnings I've had from this show. Really enjoyed it. So if you are in any way affiliated with any organization, for-profit, non-for-profit, doesn't really matter, but there's some event where you think they might be looking for a keynote, I appreciate if you would keep me in mind for that. I can be reached at glenn@theartofexcellence.com. Thank you all for listening. We are inching closer to episode 100. Super excited for that sometime later this year. In the meantime, keep being excellent. Tune in next time. Thanks, everybody.